Okay, so now I'll get down to the very nitty-gritty one, then I should stop. I don't have too much of a sense how long I've spoken here. What the U.S. has been willing to do.
Whether it is in human rights or in this case the nuclear issue. For example, the fact that India has not signed the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, nor, as far as I know, has Pakistan. Now, why is Mr. Bush doing this? I mean, for all the reasons that have been cited, which are all to the point, but clearly there's a new market that America sees in India. I mean, you have a, depending on who you believe, it's either a middle class of 200 million or 400 or 500 or whatever it is. But there is a large and growing middle class with a large and growing purchasing power, and that's likely to grow. So clearly there are commercial interests as well. What I'm saying really is that it seems to me that there is a certain kind of, if you will, diplomatic and sovereign hypocrisy built into this situation, where if you're going to hold the rest of the world to certain criteria concerning the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, then India should be held to it as well, regardless of the deals that were referred to earlier, whether it was the gas deal or the commercial deals. And this inconsistency is hardly, I guess, exclusive to the Bush administration. But it has been very pronounced in relations between Washington and much of the world. I'm reasonably familiar with the Middle East, where this kind of selective friendship and the applications of that selective friendship are visible. But it seems to me that I don't mean to be unpatriotic about India. I'm not an Indian citizen, I was born there. But whatever the needs are, and they are legitimate in terms of generating electricity through or power through the nuclear process, it seems to me that the Indians ought to be held more accountable to what it is that they are. It's not enough for them to say, but we're not going to, have another nuclear test or just set off a bomb. Take our word for it. I mean, take whose word for it? Today you have the Congress party in power, tomorrow you may have some other coalition in power. Or you may have some other, homogeneous party, in the sense that a party that does not rely on coalition. So are you going to then continually keep on updating these understandings with India? And what treaties do is to put into place certain agreed upon definitions of what protocols and relations between nations are going to be. And it just seems to me that that's what's missing in this whole equation. So that the critics of India in this case, I think, are to some extent justified. I do feel that whatever the legitimate needs of India as far as nuclear power goes, I'm not so sure that India's refusal to sign the NPT, and which, by the way, has never really been made clear, and unless my colleagues here have an explanation, I'd be very curious as to why India refuses to sign the NPT. In other words, what's the problem? Iran has signed it.
Well, backing up a little bit, in the same regard, but backing up a little bit, it's interesting, in 1998, of course, when the BJP came to power, and actually the BJP had promised, I have to think back now, we will review the nuclear policy, give us 6 months, we will do nothing. Or maybe it was 12, but maybe it was 6, something like that. After all, we have to familiarize ourselves with these secrets and everything, right?
6 weeks.
6 weeks? Yeah, they got it wrong. So it's interesting. I mean, it is if in fact India wants to develop nuclear power, if they hadn't done that, they'd be in a much better position to have gotten somehow made peace with the NPT regime in some way, and to move forward with investment and foreign technology, and to do it, and hopefully to do it in such a way that you don't become dependent after, first of all, demonstrating to the world that you can do all these things independently. I mean, especially in the thorium side of things, they've really accomplished a lot of things. However, what I thought was very interesting at the time, there was this big hue and cry, which I think in the press, which it turns out, and looking into it, I really believe was theater. The Americans were like, oh my God, why is it again another intelligence failure. We had no idea this would happen. Wasn't anyone watching? You know, after all, we know they have these things, you know, and this kind of thing. And there was this big hue and cry. But however, I went back and looked in some detail at speeches American officials had given beforehand, and the president of the Asia Society, who was a former ambassador to India, and so forth. And the concern was not about India having nukes. I mean, there was the customary, yeah, they have nukes and you have to be careful about them. But the discussion was very much what you're saying. This is a country that's unstable. This is really bad. This is a big problem. And they haven't done the neoliberal thing yet either. So we have problems on two fronts here. They haven't, you know, they're not making this transition. And part of the reason is just because the country is unstable. No government dares do anything. So who gets elected? I mean, I don't think I'm too out in left field to say a party that you could call a fascist party. The BJP gets elected, it has this RSS, you know, very right-wing groups associated with it. So you have the largest democracy in the world, has an organization elected that's been involved in all sorts of internal pogroms and very questionable things. And there's some question as to what's going to happen in India after this instability. This is sort of a classic type of development that's happened in other democracies before. Now, do you have the United States saying, this is a serious problem? We're going to put embargoes on this country, and you know, the leaders' accounts are going to be seized, we're going to stop the traveling and so forth. Sanctions if you violate democracy, right? No. Well, it's what the discussion was, and a number of these speeches I went back and looked at, is above all else, the nuclear program is secondary. Above all else is stability. Because only from a position of stability can the internal reforms that are necessary, that is the market reforms, take place. They didn't care. I mean, they didn't tell the intelligence service to look closely. And of course, when the bombs were blown up, this is part of the BJP trying to cause more national chauvinism and national unity so that they can do what they want to do. And what do they surprise the world with? You know, they carry out these neoliberal reforms. And the U.S. was very happy with this. Of course, they put on these sanctions and so forth. But you see where everything comes around in the end, that we can get past this, you know, and make this alliance, in fact. And this alliance didn't start under Congress only, you know. This is something going on. So it's a complicated, there's a lot of theater involved and a lot of complication, but when you have great, large countries, great nations, going from here to here and changing, the political economy is significantly changing, and political directions and alliances. Anyway, there's all, that's enough said, but so even there, again, many things the U.S. makes it an issue of the nuclear issue, but it's not really the nuclear issue. And I would just say that I don't think it's got very little to do with nuclear, what's been going on with Iran. It's got to do with the fact they have the second biggest reserves of oil in the world. After, I mean, the third biggest after, you know, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and then Iran. And they're essentially offline because of American sanctions. And that's, you know, what it's really about. But
and also, I mean, of course, all foreign policy is dictated by self-interest.
Yes.
So whether it is American foreign policy or Indian or Iranian foreign policy, it just flows from what leaders perceive to be the self-interest of their own country. And I think Tom is right. I think there is so much theater in politics, and so much of what is said for public consumption isn't necessarily what is said in private deals or in closed, well, I don't know whether you can call them smoke-filled rooms anymore with all the bans on tobacco, but and neither can you call them hashish-filled rooms. They're filled with something, just hot air maybe sometimes, but it seems to me that there is clearly a certain amount, a certain degree of transactional, shall we say, interrelationship that goes on between the communists in India and the various factions that we are not privy to. And after all, these are people, anyone who's been in New Delhi, and I know both have, I think, know that the degree to which political opponents socialize and to the degree to which there is that kind of private camaraderie suggests that really there are discussions that go on that are not reported in the media, which brings me back to my own sort of, if you will, feel or endeavor. And therefore, like my panelists here, I think my fellow panelists, I do tend to be somewhat kind of mindful of the fact that what you here is not necessarily what is really said, and what is said is certainly not what you necessarily hear.
You had a question?
A couple of questions. One is, how badly do you think America needs external nuclear markets? Because I've been reading about how the consumption in America of nuclear energy is not growing, but production might be. So they might need, how badly do they need the Indian market? My second question is, why do you think America is trying to move away so much themselves from the NPT? Because it sounds like a treaty which is very much in their favor, but even then, they're moving to the Proliferation Security Initiative and things like that. And my third question is slightly flippant, but how far do you think China is playing a role in the domestic sort of problem, the opposition in India to the treaty?
Well, it remains to be seen what's going to play out with nuclear power, but it does seem that there's going to be this renaissance of nuclear power. We'll see how far it goes. If someone approached it from the angle of you really want to do something about global warming, it would take an enormous effort. We're talking about 100 new coal-fired power plants in China. 150. It's amazing the numbers that are coming online. But there's reasons to believe this might happen, and there's many countries who are very interested in this, who don't want to burn their oil that they can make a lot of money on otherwise, and so forth. And there are reasons. Now, it's the case that, for example, I know something about the oil sector. When the U.S. goes into a country like Iraq and rearranges things, or with a number of other countries, it's interesting. This is not it's not a mercantilist power in the sense of the old type of colonialism or neo-colonialism. Generally, it's not only, there are exceptions in its own backyard in Latin America and that, but usually they create a certain landscape for capitalism generally, for world capitalism, sort of like Rome building the roads. They step on a lot of toes, but it also gives the U.S. a certain legitimacy vis-a-vis its main rivals, the other big economic powers, in the sense that it creates this landscape and allows their companies to move in. It creates a landscape where their companies can move in, where they don't have the diplomatic clout, they don't have the aircraft carriers, the military, and so forth. And that gives it a greater hegemony beyond, it makes plenty of profits for its own oil companies or nuclear companies, it will. But if you only look at it on that scale, you can't understand it. In the future, you might say, well, it turned out France ended up getting most of the power plants. And you might say that, well, American policy was counterproductive, but actually, because the U.S. guarantees the landscape, the French are beholden to the Americans in a various way. And this is the same with oil companies all over the world, too. So you have to get sort of beyond that one-to-one correspondence, I think, why the Iraq War is worth it to the empire. You can't just explain it on that basis. Your second question was interesting. I can't recall what it was now.
Well, it was why is America tried to move away from the LPT, because it's a treaty which is pretty much in its favor.
Yeah, of course it is. However, you have the history of India that was able to develop nuclear weapons outside of it, and now they want this country to be an ally. So you have to find a way to bring them in. Good luck getting all the other powers to agree to change it so it can be the American ally. You're not going to get it changed because India is not going to give up nuclear weapons per se, right? It's not going to happen, and so it's important for the U.S. to make an exception. On the other hand, Iran was doing the same thing. At least it was believed they were doing the same thing India intended to do, but there they wanted to stop them because there's this problem with they don't want them to control their own oil willy-nilly, right? And so they make an exception. So exceptions are made. That's not what's sacred here. But the NPT structure generally sort of works for the U.S. And what I was trying to explain is there's a new structure they're trying to impose that's similar to what's imposed on the Iranians. And the Indians, if you look at the details, what they're doing with the Indians, what they're doing with Gulf states, doing a number of places, there's going to be these additional protocols, there are going to be closed cycles, and only a certain so just like in the NPT, a handful can get nuclear weapons, a handful will be able to have the full nuclear cycle. We'll see if India gets invited into that group. And so there's something like that.
You don't think it's a more sort of systemic move away from the NPT? Because there was this whole NPT conference and
Right.
these 5-year conferences.
Right.
And America was most disinterested in agreeing to any of the sort of negotiation points, partly because these developing countries brought up this whole question of disarmament all over again and so on.
Right, I mean,
So
but if this new structure that the U.S. wants to impose sort of goes beyond the NPT, and if they get this, it'll hook, there will be this renaissance, there will be this renaissance, but it'll happen in a new way that's more restrictive than the NPT for those countries. And, so in a way, they have a disrespect for the NPT, but that doesn't mean they want things fast and loose. They want a new order, and they're working in that direction. There might be some difference, Democrats, Republicans, but not a lot underneath.
Also, the terms of the NPT are indefinite, and that was agreed in 1995, or 1999, that this is in perpetuity as perpetuity goes, of course.
Yeah.
But just one quick response, not response, but just an addition to what Tom was saying. Let's say, let's take as an assumption that this whole deal with the US and India goes through. Talking about whether the Americans really need India as a market in terms of nuclear technology, they may well need it. I mean, everyone needs markets. You need to be able to sort of globalize your economy and tap additional market. But there is no guarantee that's going to happen. There are other nuclear providers or providers of nuclear technology in Europe, particularly, who enjoy an advantage over American suppliers. And the advantage is this. The advantage is that those countries, and I'm thinking of France in particular, do not have the equivalent of what we do in America, which is the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which was passed after the Lockheed scandals, of the 70s and so on. So that, in other words, American companies can't bribe the Indian Commerce Minister or the Minister of Energy and Petroleum. I'm not saying that those ministers are bribable, although I have my private views, but I am saying that it's not possible for, say, the president of whatever Westinghouse is called these days to go across to New Delhi and say, pal, here is $300,000 and, what's $300,000 between friends. The Europeans can say that, not in so many words. They, of course, speak in French or in German. But the fact is that they have that discretion, which I think America doesn't. Is it as obvious as that? Of course not. Is it subtle? Of course it is. But it is by no means guaranteed. So you will have a situation where the Americans may be the door openers and somebody else walks into the door.
Yeah.
But do they have a nuclear lobby? And is it prepared to lobby? I mean, do they have a strong nuclear lobby? I'm interested in what will happen if the deal doesn't go through before this government, comes to an end.
Just one specific thing I can say. After I described, what you can read in the New York Times and other papers, when the Indian ambassador and Bush had this exchange, very shortly thereafter, the response of the French was, "Excuse me, you said we were embargoing them, so we did it, so we didn't sign any deals. And now you also got the American companies first footed by doing this." And they were a little bit ticked about that, the French. But we'll see how it plays out,
But I think that actually all the comments you said, right? Once a market is pried open, unless you have, the most conditional restrictive agreement, which is a bilateral agreement, which these are not, right? Anybody can come in. I mean, you must have seen this 3-4 weeks ago. Manmohan Singh 2 weeks ago was in 3 weeks ago in Moscow, and there was talk again. A lot of it was in the Hindu and the Indian press that Moscow is willing to basically upgrade and send new nuclear reactors for the facility in Tamil Nadu. And the communists at the time, this gets to your third question, right? It's linked to this. The communists now, in the last week and a half, if you read the Indian press, are basically chastising Manmohan Singh, saying, well, why didn't you accept the Russian offer? And it's because you're so pro-American. Now, Manmohan Singh, in his fairness, said, well, they can't give me anything until we sign that American deal so that the nuclear supplier group will basically take us off the list, right? And this gets partly to your question about where does China fit into all of this. And what's really interesting about it is that China doesn't figure in the press, but it's on everybody's minds. You talk about this public-private distinction. So when the BJP tested the nuclear device in 1998, L.K. Advani was the home minister, right? And the first thing he did was he went and demonized China. He said the reason we tested this, when Bill Clinton apparently phoned him up, Vajpayee, as Prime Minister, and said, why did you test? He said, because China is basically cooperating with Pakistan to building their devices, which was true. But that wasn't the reason why the Indian government tested. But they ended up demonizing China in the press, and the Chinese, of course, got incredibly pissed off, to be diplomatic about it. And that set back relations about 2-3 years. Now, you know, there's sort of, China and India now have this incredibly complicated relationship, which is partly based on suspicion and fear and anxiety, and partly on mutual interest. They realize they have to collaborate in a number of fields. And what's interesting there is that when it comes to the communists don't talk about China. Right? And it's partly because, and this is my own, to talk about private views, I mean, I find the reason I study communist party politics is because, you know, some of the positions they take, I think, are very laudable. Some of them I find mystifying, which is why they're great to study. Because you can't understand what they're saying. In the last week, Sitaram Yechuri, who's, this is all on the web, isn't it? Anyway, Sitaram Yechuri was saying to, said in Parliament and said to the press, why doesn't India try to build better relations with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization? Right? This is Central Asian Pact, which has been evolving in the last 2 years, which is about military cooperation and energy and economic ties. And the two leaders in this pact are Russia and China. The communists have been really promoting this. Why? Because it's a bulwark against American, I don't think there's any American hegemony now, but American dominance. And what's interesting is that the communists will never say anything about the regimes in China or Russia, right? But then they will talk about the importance of being democratic. So there's this kind of weird schizophrenic, and sometimes this sort of silence when it comes to communists about the question of China. And in fact, even critics of the communists, people in the Communist Party who are moderates, let's just say the pragmatists, those who are saying we should have more liberalization in India. You shouldn't stop all this liberalization in New Delhi. And I'm not saying I'm for this position, because one thing that's happened with liberalization in the 90s is inequality has grown rapidly across sectors and across regions, right? That's what the communists, the ideologues are fighting against. But pragmatists say, you keep talking about Communist Party ideology. Have you looked at what's happening in China? Right? Since Deng Xiaoping, this is a state which is still run by the Communist Party. It has lots of factions within it. But there are obviously also a lot of pragmatists there as well. So there's a kind of real disconnect between the ideological speak, right, and what is practically done. And partly sometimes it's theater, but I've interviewed, a few years ago now, but I interviewed basically the top brass of the Communist Party of India, the CPI, and the CPM. And I really walked away thinking, this is genuine. They really believe in this ideological view, some of them. Some of the ones who run the party now, they definitely do. And so you have all these contradictions or omissions that don't really make sense. And they don't make sense because they're not addressed. Right? Nobody tries to think about them coherently. So I do think China is definitely back. It's the main issue for America. It's on everybody's mind. You go to New Delhi or Calcutta or Bombay today, everyone is thinking about China with a mixture of anxiety and awe and sometimes confidence, depends on...
Yeah. I mean, the whole U.S.-India alliance that's being built up is very much about counterbalance in China in a certain way. Right. The U.S. is extremely active in all sorts of things with the Shanghai Cooperation Council and
the
various
quadrilateral agreements with the naval exercises.
And it's not Democrats versus Republicans. You know, Clinton was the one who made the big push on all the stands and got all the American bases in there. And, you know.
And also, of course, you see, everything is related to everything else. I mean, that's what it is, which is that the nuclear situation related to opening up commercial markets, which is related to geopolitical security for the Americans, which is related to the relationship between Pakistan and India and China and Pakistan. So, you know, it's a kaleidoscope in a way. And I wonder as a journalist that beyond panels like these, whether and who actually sits and thinks through all these enormous complications, because they are complications, you know. And there are complications that aren't, you're quite right, they aren't only theater. They are theater in the sense that they appear theater as far as public perceptions go, and what somebody says one day, and it's the moral equivalent of Khrushchev taking a shoe and banging it on the desk at the Security Council, whatever year it was, 59 or 60. But I think that I'm a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, for example, and there are all these discussions that go on there, and these task forces that produce these wonderful reports. But I've often wondered as a journalist, whatever happens to all of this stuff, you know? Does it sort of get put into some kind of a central computer which just spits out, you know, option A, option B, option C, or whatever? Is there a master plan for this sort of post-globalization world of ours, in which each section of the world is taken into, a region of the world is taken into account? I mean, I don't want to sound like a Hollywood scriptwriter of some sort, although there could well be a film one day in this, in which case you heard this first here. But I think that, I think there is scope and indeed an opportunity to be able to kind of go beyond this sort of easy speak and ideo speak and come up with perhaps a more thoughtful sense of where specific regions are going, what are their priorities, and what are their flashpoints, and how best to address them. I think there needs to be a certain kind of a, perhaps, not only a national conversation in this country and in India, but perhaps even a global conversation. Because there are so many more players involved in these issues today than there were, say, a decade ago.
Well, I think that's a good note for us to end on as the first event of our Global Energy Forum. I'd like to thank all of our panelists deeply. And a reminder, like I said, we will have the audio online on our website, along with pictures and some video. So thank you for coming, and I hope you will continue to join us in the spring for additional events.
Thanks for the invitation.